ewe light on man and the great apes, fully illustrated wireless possibilities, wireless in war, crime, business, and pleasure, with 4 diagrams, Tantalus, or the future of man, the evolution of human morality, a naturalistic approach by J.B.S Haldane Callinicus, a defense of chemical warfare, other volumes in the Today and Tomorrow series Daedalus, or Science, and The Future by J.B.S Haldane, Icarus, or The Future of Iphyra, Science by Bertrand Russell, F.R.S. the Mongol in Our Midst by F.G. Cruikshank, M.D.N., by F.C.S. Schiller. Man possesses primitive animal passions. He will bring about his own destruction unless The Passing of the Phantoms, Lysistrata, or Woman and the Future, by Professor Patton, Experiments on Animal Intelligence, shed light on the evolution of morals in both men and animals, by Anthony M. Ludovici Perseus, or of Dragons, by H. F. Scott Stokes, M.A. Narcissus, An Anatomy of Clothes, author of Daedalus or Science and the Future, etc. Illustration, New York, E. P. Dutton Company, 681 Fifth Ave. By Gerald Hurd, E. P. Dutton Company, Callinicus, A Defense of Chemical Warfare, by J.B.S Haldane, Sir William. Dunn Reader, in Biochemistry, Cambridge University, copyright 1925 by E. P. Dutton Company, all rights reserved, printed in the United States of America, Callinicus. The public mind has to a large extent reacted against the opinions impressed on it during the war by official propaganda. Some of these have been overcome by counter-propaganda in the press and on the platform. Others have been dropped because they led to effects which, though admirable during a war, were undesirable in peacetime. But, as chemical warfare will not become significant until the onset of another major conflict, and with no mention of it in any political party's agenda, people still view it through the lens of what the newspapers portrayed during World War I can only plead that, unlike the average clergyman or politician, I have warned my audience in advance, and shall attempt, though no doubt vainly, to be impartial. Now, I am to some extent a chemist, so I can no longer be expected to be impartial in my assessment of chemistry's worth, just as a politician or a clergyman cannot be expected to provide an unbiased view on the value of politics or religion. A few of my hearers hold the view that, while war in itself is a noble occupation, the use of poisonous gas is an innovation as cruel as it is unsoldierly. War will be prevented only by a scientific study of its causes, such as has prevented most epidemic diseases. If so, I certainly share their objection to war, but I doubt whether by objecting to it we are likely to avoid it in future, however lofty our motives or disinterested our conduct. For many centuries, people had guessed that epidemic diseases constituted a punishment for human misconduct of some kind. The majority are probably pacifists, in the sense that they prefer almost any peace to almost any war, support the League of Nations or other devices for the prevention of international strife, and view preparations for future warfare. Oh, yeah. Particularly future chemical warfare with suspicion. They tried to prevent them by prayer and almsgiving. Christians gave up washing. Hindus liberated rats captured during plague epidemics. Religious orders and priests of the Church gave the most magnificent examples of self-sacrifice in times of pestilence. But that was not the way in which pestilences can be prevented. Besides good intentions, a special type of accurate thinking was needed. We have not yet made a scientific study of the causes of war, and, until we do, may expect more wars. That is why I am speaking on warfare to my fellow countrymen. If we are to have more wars, I prefer that my country should be on the winning side. In general, pacifists are a very great military advantage to Britain. This keeps us out of some wars, and leads to our showing unsuspected power in others. After a few years of war, when originally bellicose politicians like Lord Lansdowne are growing tired, ex-pacifists like Lloyd George and Pitt have just found their rhythm. On the outbreak of war, the large majority of them become intensely patriotic, whereas beforehand they lead our own military authorities and also those of our potential allies and enemies to underestimate our strength. Thus, the national staying power is greatly increased. I need hardly remark that future governments will not engage in war without first persuading the vast majority of the people of its justice. This appears to be a relatively simple process under modern conditions. At the present moment, however, pacifists are combining with the less competent soldiers in an attempt to check the progress of chemical warfare. This I believe to be neither in our national nor in the international interest. Until 1915, the soldiers' business was to push or throw pieces of metal at the enemy. Various devices have been employed for throwing them fast or far, and some of them threw other pieces on arrival at their destination, thanks, in the main, to the genius of the unforgotten Major General Shrapnel. In the 15th century, the defenders of Belgrade against the Turks had devised a similar tactic, reportedly under the direct inspiration of the Holy Ghost. However, these weapons had become obsolete, as their primary impact was psychological. It is true that early in the 8th century A.D., the appropriately named Syrian Callinicus prolonged the life of the Eastern Roman Empire for another 750 years, and saved a large part of Christendom from Mohammedan domination by his invention of a fire, Greek fire, an inflammable liquid which was, however, later superseded by gunpowder. Chemical warfare had been foreseen by statesmen, and in 1907 the signatories of the Hague Conference agreed to renounce the use of projectiles designed solely for the dissemination of asphyxiating or noxious gases. They were thus debarred from using lacrimatory gas, the most humane weapon ever invented, but permitted to discharge gas from cylinders on the ground, an exceedingly cruel practice. This regulation was well meant, but the path to August 1914 was paved with good intentions. During the war, 25 different poisonous weapons were employed. In 1914, none of the great powers had made any preparation for poison gas warfare, and it was not until April 22, 1915, more than 8 months after the beginning of the war, that the Germans began its use. Of these, only 3 are gases at ordinary temperatures and can be discharged from cylinders in which they are stored under pressure. The remainder are liquids that gradually evaporate, yielding a poisonous vapor, or solids that are poisonous in the form of smoke. These poisonous substances, so far used, fall into 4 classes according to their effect on men. First come gases and vapors which are poisonous when breathed, but have no effect on the skin, and affect the eyes or nose only when present in concentrations which are poisonous to the lungs. They can all be kept out by respirators, and were of military value only against unprotected troops or in local surprise action. This group, which included chlorine and phosgene, are probably almost as obsolete as muzzle-loading cannon. A second group are poisonous only in very high concentrations, but irritate the eyes when present in amounts so small that 1 part in 5 million may render a man blind with weeping in a few seconds. They can be kept out by respirators, or even goggles. There is no evidence, so far as I know, that anyone was killed or even permanently blinded by these substances, but they had a great momentary effect. The third group of poisonous smokes, mostly arsenic compounds, were little developed during the war. In small amounts, these smokes merely make one sneeze. They are, however, weapons of very great efficiency, and it is well known that they would have been used by the British, at any rate, on a very extensive scale in 1919. In somewhat larger amounts, they cause pain of the most terrifying character in the head and chest. The pain in the head is described as like that caused when fresh water gets into the nose when bathing, but infinitely more severe. These symptoms are accompanied by the most appalling mental distress and misery. Yet within 48 hours the large majority had recovered, and practically none became permanent invalids. Some soldiers poisoned by these substances had to be prevented from committing suicide. Others temporarily went raving mad, and tried to burrow into the ground to escape from imaginary pursuers. These substances, when in the form of smoke, will penetrate any of the respirators used in the late war, though the British box respirator would stop all but a little of them in the concentrations then used. In future, they will probably be used in much larger concentrations and in finer particles than those formed by the German smoke shells. It is extraordinarily difficult to produce a respirator which will completely stop very fine smoke for the following reason. In a gas, the molecules or ultimate particles are moving very rapidly, with speeds of several hundred yards per second, continually colliding and rebounding. A gas molecule, therefore, will probably hit the sides of a fairly narrow passage through which it is drawn, but a smoke particle moves at a speed measured in inches per second, and is far less likely to hit the wall of the respirator, being held by its absorbent surface. If we try to make the passages through which air is drawn very narrow, as by sucking in our air through cotton wool, which will stop most smokes, we find that we have created an appalling resistance to breathing. There is an electrical method of completely removing smoke particles, but it would likely more than double the weight of respirators, and does not appear to be either waterproof or foolproof. The American fluoride, of which so much was heard in 1918 and 1919, is a substance of this class. The fourth group of blistering gases contains only one substance used during the war, dichlorethyl sulfide, or mustard gas. This is really a liquid whose vapour is not only poisonous when breathed, but blisters any part of the skin with which it comes into contact even. To take an example, a drop of the liquid was put on a piece of paper and left for 5 minutes on a man's sleeve. The vapour penetrated his coat and woolen shirt, causing a blister the effects of which lasted 6 weeks, and yet evaporation is so slow that ground contaminated by the liquid may remain dangerous for a week. Mustard gas caused more casualties to the British than all other chemical weapons put together. Such are the weapons which chemistry has given us. It is often asked why chemists cannot produce something which will put our foes comfortably to sleep, and allow us to take them prisoners. The answer is that such substances exist, but that in small amounts they are harmless, in large amounts fatal. It is only over a moderate range of concentrations that their effect is merely stupefying. One has only to think of the familiar case of chloroform vapour, and the skill required to give neither too much nor too little. It would be logical to speak of explosives under the heading of chemical warfare, but there is curiously little chance of explosives becoming any more effective. But the remoteness of the day when we shall use these forces may best be judged by an analogy. Of course, if we could utilize the forces which we now know to exist inside the atom, we should have such capacities for destruction that I do not know of any agency other than divine intervention which would save humanity from complete and peremptory annihilation. We know fairly well the maximum amount of energy which can possibly be got out of a chemical action, and, though explosives might perhaps be made which were about twice as destructive as our best or worst today, they would probably be far less stable, and therefore less safe to their users. Some thousands of years ago, someone first realized that the sun, moon, and stars were not mere bodies as large as a plate or a house, but very large, and moving very fast. It was an obvious idea that their motions might be exploited in some way. Wise men observed them, and hoped, for example, to increase the probability of success in their own enterprises by beginning them when Jupiter was in the ascendant. They led to astronomy, and so to all modern physics. These attempts were unsuccessful, though far more valuable to humanity than most of the methods successfully employed for the same purposes, such as fraud, violence, and corruption. We now know that the only probable way of harnessing the kinetic energy of celestial bodies is to use tidal power to generate electric currents. But 5,000 years ago, hitching one's wagon to a star was a reasonable endeavour, and not a poetic metaphor. The reason we cannot do it is a matter of scale, and the same holds true for our inability to harness subatomic phenomena. We cannot make apparatus small enough to disintegrate or fuse atomic nuclei, any more than we can make it large enough to reach to the moon. We can only bombard them with particles of which perhaps 1 in a million hit, which is like firing keys at a safe door from a machine gun, a mile away, in an attempt to open it. We do occasionally open it, but the process is very uneconomical. It may be asked why we cannot bring our machine gun nearer, or improve our aim. To do this, we should require to construct apparatus on the same infinitesimal scale as the structure of the chemical atom. Now we can arrange atoms into various patterns. This is called chemical synthesis. For example, we can arrange carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen atoms in patterns which constitute the molecules of sugar, glycerine, or alcohol at will. We have been doing it by rule-of-thumb methods for thousands of years, and are just beginning to learn a little about it. But even chemical molecules are much too large for our purposes. We can no more ask a chemist to build our apparatus than expect a theatrical scene painter or a landscape gardener to do us a miniature. We know very little about the structure of the atom, and almost nothing about how to modify it. To see how chemical weapons are likely to be used in future, we must study their employment in the late war, and the prospect of constructing such an apparatus seems to me to be so remote that, when some successor of mine is lecturing to a party spending a holiday on the moon, it will still be an unsolved, though not, I think, an ultimately insoluble problem. Lachrymatory gas was only once used under ideal conditions by the Germans in the Argonne in 1915. They captured a fairly extensive French trench system and about 2,400 prisoners, almost all unwounded, but temporarily blind. And this was quite true. When they gave the number of prisoners, the French authorities naturally protested that this figure was practically equal to their total casualties. The French were unprotected. They were deluged with shells emitting a vapour which temporarily blinded them. They couldn't even escape. The Germans walked across, removed their rifles, and formed them up into columns that marched back, each led by a German in goggles. In order to make future wars humane, it would only be necessary to introduce the two following rules. 1. No goggles or other eye protection shall be worn. 2. No shells shall be used containing any other substances, save ethyl iodoacetate or other lachrymatory compound, and a small bursting charge. Certainly it is unlikely that such rules will ever be adopted, but I do contend that to forbid the use of such substances is a piece of sentimentalism as cruel as it is ridiculous. Gases of the first group were used in clouds discharged from cylinders, sometimes on a front of several miles. They probably caused at least 20,000 casualties among unprotected or inadequately protected British troops. At least a quarter of these died, and that very painfully, in many cases after a struggle for breath lasting several days. On the other hand, of those who did not die, almost all recovered completely, and the symptoms of the few who became permanent invalids were mainly nervous. Besides being wounded, I have been buried alive, and on several occasions in peacetime I have been asphyxiated to the point of unconsciousness. Apart, however, from the extreme terror and agitation produced by the gassing of uneducated people, I regard the type of wound produced by the average shells as, on the whole, more distressing than the pneumonia caused by chlorine or phosgene. The pain and discomfort arising from the other experiences were utterly negligible compared with those produced by a good septic shell wound. The first German cloud gas attack was in April 1915, the last in August 1916. Though the British continued them until the end of that year, they gradually became more and more ineffective as the efficiency of the respirators used on both sides increased. The initial German attacks were very well conducted in terms of releasing gas, as they were organized by Haber, an exceptionally skilled chemist who subsequently oversaw their production of explosives. On the contrary, German respirators were initially poor, and later did not match the quality of those used by the British. This was, apparently, because the most competent physiologist in Germany, with any knowledge of breathing, was a Jew. This fact was quite well known in German physiological circles, but apparently his race prevented the military authorities from employing him. That was how the Germans paid for anti-Semitism. The result was that they were unable to follow up their gas attacks at all closely, but had to wait till the cloud had passed off, by which time resistance was again possible. It was indeed fortunate for the Germans that the Russians were still more anti-Semitic than themselves. Hundreds of thousands of Russian Jews volunteered for service in 1914. It is very probable that it lost them the war, as never again, not even in March 1918, had they as complete a gap in the Franco-British Western Front as during the first gas attack in April 1915. They were mostly refused, and in no case granted commissions. They then proceeded to turn their combative instincts into other channels, to the no small advantage of the Germans. The other reason why the cloud gas attacks were indecisive was that the Germans had relatively few reserves to put into the gap they made. Their reserves in April 1915 were in Poland. If one goes to what is perhaps the opposite extreme from Russia, one finds the army of the world's most democratic nation, Australia, commanded by a Jew, Monash, and notes with interest that the Germans regarded the Australian troops as Henri von Hole, the most formidable man for man of all their opponents. If they had trusted their scientific men, they could certainly have captured Calais and Boulogne, and probably have annihilated the British army. But these bombardments, though they caused many casualties, were never decisive, as the cloud attacks would have been, but for causes which we have discussed. In addition to clouds released from cylinders in the trenches, gas cylinders were fired from trench mortars, some hundreds at a time, into the enemy's lines, producing a sudden and dense cloud of gas before the men had time to put on their hair. Respirators. Mustard gas is a very different thing. It was never used to force a decision by breaking the enemy's lines, but to cause him casualties and deny him the use of ground. He ate his meals off the mantelpiece for a month. Someone placed a drop of the liquid on the chair of the director of the British Chemical Warfare Department. For after a given area has been well sprayed with dichlorethyl sulfide from bursting shells for some time, it is death to occupy it without a mask, and the vapour may blister the skin, while anyone touching the ground will be certain of a very serious blister. The most interesting thing, however, about mustard gas is that, though it caused 150,000 casualties in the British Army alone, less than 4,000 of these, or 1 in 40, died, while only about 700, or 1 in every 200, became permanently unfit. It is worthwhile attempting to analyze the reasons for this rather curious decision. Yet the Washington Conference has solemnly agreed that the signatory powers are not to use this substance against one another, though of course they will use such humane weapons as bayonets, shells, and incendiary bombs. First, perhaps, we must put the complete and shameful ignorance of most of the politicians and many of the soldiers who took part in the conference. But it is the task of politicians and soldiers, perhaps even journalists, to know the truth about such matters before making decisions, or even urging others to do so. Their ideas of gas warfare were apparently drawn from the descriptions of the great German cloud gas attacks of 1915, which killed at least 1 in 4 of their casualties, and were written up on a large scale for recruiting and political purposes. I would remind you of the conduct of the Chevalier Bayard, whom his contemporary soldiers described as sans peur et sans reproche. To this ignorance, however, there was joined one of the most hideous forms of sentimentalism which has ever supported evil upon earth, the attachment of the professional soldier to cruel and obsolete killing machines, half of its original extent. To captured knights, and even bowmen, he was the soul of courtesy, but musketeers or other users of gunpowder who fell into his hands were invariably put to death. I remember an excellent example of Bayardism in the war. It is worth remembering that, until the invention of gunpowder, fighting had for many centuries been remarkably safe for anyone who could afford a good suit of armour, while the abominable arquebus and its descendants have saved the remnants of a fort. Christendom, from the Turks, Mongols, and other pagans who had, by Bayard's time, successfully overwhelmed on it. A Turkish airman had developed considerable flair for shooting down our observation balloons. A British officer sent up one of these latter with a large cargo of gun-cotton, and blew up the Turk in question. For this deed he was severely reprimanded by the local officer commanding RAF for unsportsmanlike conduct. This gentleman, doubtless, felt little objection to bombing, for example, Turkish transport columns, consisting mainly of non-combatants and animals incapable of retaliating, but he objected to airmen being killed, except by other airmen. One may remark that between wounds and thirst, perhaps 30,000 Turkish transport animals perished during our final victory in Palestine. I, fighting in the mud beneath them, and exposed to bombs from both sides, I was severely wounded by one of our own, felt differently. Resources of science and fighting dirty. The opponents of the present world order may, therefore, welcome Bayardism in their governments. Meanwhile, the Bayardists have secured a peculiar coalition of allies in their thus far successful endeavour to prevent the humanization of warfare. An attempt by the professional soldiers to stereotype the art of war into the channels which correspond to the ideas of 1914 might lead to a future rather different from that which I shall venture to predict, a future in which the military organizations of the world were overthrown by the exponents of some other mode of thinking, employing all faith. First are a number of out-and-out pacifists who object to all war, and apparently hoped to make it more difficult by restricting the means of fighting aloud. Some, of course, genuinely believe that gaseous weapons are more cruel than solid ones. Those who know the facts seem to me to be the victims of loose thinking. With them are associated a group of sentimentalists who appear to me definitely to be the scribes and Pharisees of our age. They defend their consciences for such behavior by attacking, in the name of their God or their ideals, every novelty, whether in thought or in action, which presents any loophole. In particular, they are distinguished by ferocious opposition to and contempt for any attempt at solving human problems through honest and simple intellectual effort. These people, who are to be found in all political parties and most religious and irreligious sects, are generally willing after a decent interval to accept any application of science which appears to them profitable, or any social institution such, as war, which is hallowed by use and wont. Mustard gas kills 1 man for every 40 it puts out of action. Shells kill 1 for every 3. But their God, who compromised with high explosives, has not yet found time to adapt himself to chemical warfare. These people have a case, and are prepared to argue it. They would honestly desire to give up Lazare Carnot's gunpowder for Bayard's sword. But one cannot congratulate them on their associates. More respectable in every way are the candid reactionaries, like Lord Cecil, who believe in their hearts that in abandoning traditional religion of the medieval type for scientific thought, man has definitely chosen the wrong path, and who fight with right without path, and who fight with their eyes open against its application. How profound and unreasoning the objection of the military mind to chemical warfare can best be judged by one simple fact. And behind these follow like sheep the predestined victims of the next war, the peoples of the civilized nations who will undergo extreme suffering rather than think for themselves. About 3 years ago, the British regular army gave up the instruction of every soldier in defence against hostile gas. For one thing, speed adjusting respirators being of more importance than elegance, it did not form the basis of a satisfactory drill, like those curious relics of 18th-century musketry, which still occupy so much of the time of our recruits. But the truth no doubt was that the officers did not like that sort of thing. One of the first acts of the late government was to reinstate some modicum of anti-gas instruction in the normal training of the army. The chemical and physiological ideas which underlie gas warfare require a certain effort to understand, and they do not arise in the study of a sport, as is the case with those underlying shooting and motor transport. But it may be hoped that this pernicious and demoralizing teaching will once more be dropped with the return to power of one of the gentlemen's parties. Personally, I must confess that I would go very much further than the government, and seriously consider the provision of gas masks for the population of London and other large towns, and the instruction of school children in their use. If this is not done, there is at least the possibility of a disaster of the very first magnitude at an early stage in the next war. It is also one of the very few military measures which could hardly be regarded as provocative by the most ardent of foreign militarists or British pacifists. At the present moment, however, this need does not arise, as the French, who alone could bomb London, have very slight facilities for making mustard gas. It is interesting to compare the attitude of our militarists to defense against gas with their attitude before the war to a possible German invasion. However, there is this very fundamental difference between a defense against invasion and a defense against gas. The one would increase the importance of the professional soldier, the other would not. The fear of a German invasion, despite naval experts stating it was impossible on a large scale, had been so ingrained in the military mind by the propaganda of the National Service League and similar groups before the war that hundreds of thousands of troops were needlessly stationed in England from 1914 to 1918. As to which of us is justified, I would suggest that it is more likely today that poisonous gas will be used against British soldiers or civilians in future wars than it was in 1912 that Britain would be invaded by the Germans. One does not need to be a very profound psychologist to see in this fact one reason why the military authorities dropped anti-gas training, and why I, being a biochemist, and therefore a person of the type who would become important if gas war returned, am advocating its extension. We have seen that a case can be made out for gas as a weapon on humanitarian grounds. based on the very small proportion of killed to casualties from gas in the war, and especially during its last year. Against this may be urged the probability that future research will produce other gases or smokes which, as weapons, will be as cruel or more cruel than chlorine and phosphogenes in 1915 and 116. The answer to this is quite simple. First, as regards gases or vapors, only a limited number of chemical substances are appreciably volatile, and of their vapors only a small proportion are poisonous. Now, every chemical substance has a definite molecular weight. Those with a small molecular weight, i.e., whose molecules are relatively light, are on the whole the most volatile, i.e., go most easily into vapor. Now the large majority of the possible volatile chemical substances of small molecular weight, and therefore relatively simple chemical composition, are already known. Mustard gas, for example, was discovered and its properties described in 1886. There are probably substances of high molecular weight whose dense vapors are even more poisonous than mustard gas. But the charcoal in our respirators has the property of absorbing large molecules of vapor regardless of their chemical composition. It is therefore somewhat unlikely, though not of course impossible, that any highly poisonous vapor will ever be discovered that can penetrate a mask impermeable to mustard gas or chlorine. It is, to my mind, far more probable that skin irritants may be discovered which are even more unpleasant than mustard gas. The question of smokes is more serious. This was the German view when they introduced the Blue Cross shell in July 1917. It is not, however, at all unlikely that concentrations of smoke will be produced in the future which will penetrate our present mask. It was the hope of the producers of irritant smokes that they would penetrate the gas masks in sufficient amounts to cause sneezing and force their victims to remove their masks, thus exposing themselves to greater concentrations of smoke, and to poisonous vapors liberated along with the smoke. Fortunately, by that time our defense against gas and smoke was extremely good, and we had foreseen the smoke menace and introduced, between April and June 1917, a filter which effectively stopped it in the concentrations then met in the field. If our anti-gas measures are sufficiently neglected, the consequences may, of course, be very serious. It would seem likely that the chemical weapons of the future will not be so very unlike those of the past. The main efforts of the soldier who uses them will be devoted, first, to blistering his enemy, secondly, to tiring him out by forcing him to wear a respirator continuously, which, of course, enormously hampers him from doing anything else. In the Great War, mustard gas and sensory irritant smokes were not employed as primary weapons of attack or defense, as the smokes would not render everyone in a particular area unconscious, although they would necessitate the use of respirators. Mustard gas, on the other hand, could make any area absolutely untenable for defenders, but the vapor persisted for so many days that it could not be occupied by the attackers either. It was mainly used to produce casualties a few days or weeks before an attack on the units which would be defending, and to protect the flank of an offensive against counterattack. The Germans themselves received orders forbidding them to enter its ruins for a fortnight. Thus, in April 1918, Armentières, the original northern limit of the German attack in Flanders, was so heavily shelled with mustard that the gutters in the streets were reported to be running with it. For this purpose, the following methods present themselves. Nevertheless, mustard gas is so effective a weapon that there will almost certainly be an attempt to use it, not only to render the ground untenable for both sides, but also to gain territory from the enemy. First, attempts might be made to protect troops completely from the effect of gas on their skins by encasing them in airtight overalls and gloves. These were used with a certain amount of success by machine gunners in the Great War, but would hardly be practicable for attackers, who would, except perhaps in winter, die of heat stroke if encased in such apparatus. Airtight tanks with adequate arrangements for filtering incoming air are probably more hopeful, as mustard gas will not poison motors as it does men. The motors would, of course, have their own air supply, as it would hardly be practicable to filter air in the quantities needed by them. To support the tanks, and to deal with specially protected machine gunners, immune infantry will likely be used. On the other hand, some people are naturally immune. If a vapor is discovered against which immunity can be conferred, it will be the most effective weapon in history as long as its secret is kept. A single attack with gas poisoning, whether through inhalation or skin contact, does not confer immunity to a subsequent attack. In fact, it often enhances the sensitivity of the victim. The American Army authorities made a systematic examination of the susceptibility of large numbers of recruits. They found that there was a very resistant class, comprising 20 of the white men tried, but no less than 80 of the Negroes. This is intelligible, as the symptoms of mustard gas, blistering, and sunburn are very similar, and Negroes are pretty well immune to sunburn. It appears, therefore, that, following a minor initial test, it should be feasible to secure colored troops who would all be immune to mustard gas blistering at concentrations detrimental to most Caucasian males. Sufficiently resistant Caucasians are available for commissioning. One sees, then, the possibility of warfare on somewhat the following lines. Heavy concentrations of artillery would keep an area, say 30 miles in length and 10 in depth, continuously sprayed with mustard gas. Suddenly, behind the usual barrage of high explosive shells, appears a line of tanks supported by Negroes in gas masks. After allowing, say, 2 days for the development of blisters, the gassing of positions within 2 or 3 miles of the front line is discontinued, but a long-range bombardment, especially of roads, goes on. They meet with but little opposition in the area still reeking of gas, and occupy the hostile lines to a depth of 2 or 3 miles. The only satisfactory counter-attack would be from the air. A counter-attack, even if successful, involves concentration in an area under gas bombardment and enormous casualties from blistering. In this way, the side with a significant advantage in mustard gas should be able to advance 2 or 3 miles per day. This type of tactic was impossible during World War I for a very simple reason. There wasn't enough mustard gas. The Germans used a remarkably intricate process for its production. Unfortunately, our first supplies only arrived in the field in September 1918. When we decided to follow their example, one of our chemists, a Cambridge man, I am glad to say, hit on a vastly cheaper and speedier method of manufacture. There is reason to think that the knowledge that we were at last about to develop gas and smoke warfare on a large scale had a good deal to do with the acceptance by the Germans of the armistice condition. The reason why we did not use mustard gas earlier is also simple and rather instructive. Does it kill? Asked the general. In 1915, a British chemist proposed to a general who was concerned with such questions that the British should use dichlorethyl sulfide. No, he was told, but it will disable enormous numbers of the enemy temporarily. That is no good to us, said the man of blood. We want something that will kill. It is interesting to find how completely the ideas of this worthy soldier as to the object of war coincided with those of the average intelligent child of 5 years old. I may remind you that Clausewitz held the view that the object of war was to impose one's will upon the enemy. This idea would, however, seem to have been too abstract, too complex, or too humanitarian for the British military mind. At any rate, it had its fill of killing. It would not much upset the present balance of power, Germany's chemical industry being counterpoised by French Negro troops. Indians may be expected to be nearly as immune as Negroes. It seems, then, that mustard gas would enable an army to gain ground with far less killed on either side than the methods used in the late war, and would tend to establish a war of movement leading to a fairly rapid decision, as in the campaigns of the past. It was not, therefore, until the Germans had demonstrated on the persons of some tens of thousands of British soldiers — we had 14,000 casualties, though with only 400 deaths during the first 3 weeks of the mustard gas war — that there was something to be said for a weapon that was not primarily designed to kill, that we began to use it. And clearly, the more war is complicated, the more unimportant become semi-civilized powers, such as Turkey and Russia, even as allies. The Turks were seldom capable of organizing a combined attack by any number greater than a battalion, or a shoot by anything larger than a battery. Yet small groups of them fought very well, and their individual guns made very good shooting. But gas warfare demands organization, both of attack and defense attack, because one tries to keep up a certain concentration of vapor over a whole large area, rather than to knock out given groups of men. defense, because respirators and discipline. Only wearing them must be perfect. I need not say that, in the Great War, our military leaders strongly deprecated the use of gas against the Turks, on the ground, I believe, that the latter were gentlemen. But they never used gas. So perhaps they may have preserved their quality of gentlemen in the eyes of our Bayardists. They showed their gentlemanly character by such acts as the killing of 45 of the prisoners taken at Kudel Amara, not to mention some millions of Greeks and Armenians who had the misfortune to be Christians. Let us consider for a moment this latter allegation. We are often told the exact opposite, that it will make it more barbarous and indecisive, and lead to the wiping out of the population of whole cities. I claim, then, that the use of mustard gas in war on the largest possible scale would render it less expensive in terms of life and property, shorter, and more dependent on brains rather than numbers. Can aeroplanes do more against a hostile town with gas than with high explosive and incendiary bombs? We were threatened with gas bombs during the war, and certain London pharmacists made very large sums by the sale of alleged anti-gas masks. The same argument has been brought forward on behalf of amulets and other pious frauds sold in the name of religion. It could be, and was, urged at the time that as the carrying of these curious objects seemed to calm the civilian population in a moment of national emergency, they served a useful purpose. In the case of the above gas masks, they inspired such faith, for they had a better finish than the official pattern, and looked like one's idea of what a gas mask ought to be, that some thousands were sent out by fond relatives to soldiers at the front, a number of whom in consequence perished miserably. Was there anything in the gas bomb scare? In the first place, many otherwise well-informed people have very erroneous views as to the poisonousness of gases. Besides errors due to this cause, there were arithmetic errors. Gases are dangerous in the laboratory or factory if they kill without giving warning by odour and irritation. But gases of this kind, such as carbon monoxide and hydrogen arsenide, have to be present in order to kill in concentrations which cannot kill, practically be produced in the open. The insidiousness of hydrogen arsenide has, however, so alarmed chemists that a tradition persists of a man having been killed by a single bubble of it, while they are so afraid of smelling carbon monoxide that it is generally stated to be inodorous. In one calculation made to show how easily London could be poisoned, a decimal point went astray in one place. As the calculation concerned volumes of gas, the result came out as 10 cubic meters, or 1,000 cubic meters, instead of 1. For this reason, it seemed that 10 aeroplanes could cause the damage that would actually have required 10,000. However, most of the disaster profits from gas bombs made no calculation at all. Let us try to make a rough one. The area was not evacuated. This caused 4,500 casualties, of whom only 50 died, all of them because they took off their respirators too soon. In central London, if the population had had gas masks, the casualties would have been perhaps 10 times greater. On the nights of March 11th to March 14th, 1918, just before the great offensive of March 21st, the Germans fired 150,000 mustard gas shells into the villages and valleys of the Cambrai salient, an area of about 20 square miles, the same as that of central London. But we have to compare this hypothetical air raid, not with any raid that actually occurred, but with a bombardment of 150,000 high-explosive shells or their equivalent in bombs. Such an attack would have required the visits on repeated nights of something like 1,000 aeroplanes. This would hardly have left a house in central London untouched, and the dead would have been numbered not in hundreds, but in tens of thousands. Such a number is not yet a practical possibility. We are, perhaps, inclined to underestimate the potentialities of town bombing with high explosive and incendiary bombs. In London, for example, there were never too many big fires started at any given time for the fire brigades to deal with. In one or two air raids on other towns, it seems probable that the Germans were not far from outstripping the capabilities of the fire brigades and producing very large conflagrations. An attack by 10 or 20 times as many aeroplanes as ever bombed London simultaneously might well ring round a given area fairly completely with wrecked streets or burning houses. in which case most of the buildings and a good most of the buildings and a good inhabitants would perish. The reasons why explosives are more likely to be effective than poison on a town are as follows. Houses are far more vulnerable to explosives than earthworks, and do far more damage to their occupants in collapsing, besides being inflammable. And, on the other hand, they contain far more refuges which are nearly gas-proof. A sealed room on the first or second floor would be nearly immune to gas in the surrounding area if it did not have a lit fire to draw contaminated air from outside into it. Moreover, civilians could and would quickly evacuate an area heavily soaked with mustard gas, whereas soldiers must remain at risk to their lives. Gas bombs would certainly be far less effective than high explosives on a town whose inhabitants were provided with respirators, probably even if they were unprovided. But, so long as London is undefended in this respect, it constitutes a standing temptation to any power desirous of making this kind of experiment. Judging from experience, there is no doubt that a gas or smoke attack from the air would occasion a first-class panic. This was certainly due to ignorance. The introduction of each new chemical weapon produced great terror, as did even such a militarily unimportant, though cruel weapon as the Flammenwerfer flame projector. They also breathed less, because they did not run. The French colonial troops caught in the first cloud gas attack were far more frightened than the Canadians, and appear to have suffered far more casualties, although they mostly fled, unlike the Canadians who made attempts to improvise respirators, with almost any damp fabric, reducing the chlorine concentration by half or more. Very great alarm was caused by the first mustard gas bombardments in France, as no one had ever seen anything resembling the blisters it caused. As a matter of fact, a most efficient respirator against chlorine, though whether against mustard gas I do not know, can be made by knocking the bottom off a bottle, filling it with loose earth, placing its neck in the mouth, and breathing through it. But very soon familiarity bred contempt, or even liking, for aeroplanes dropped sheaves of pamphlets explaining how any soldier tired of the war could become a casualty without danger either of death or detection by allowing earth contaminated with mustard gas to touch the skin or the clothing. A good many wound stripes were earned by this simple and up-to-date method, though, as we had the superiority in the air, and the German soldiers were both more tired and more confiding than our own, the German casualties from this cause were probably still greater. But let us tell our civilian population before, and not after they are attacked with blistering gases, that the blisters produced are considerably less dangerous than measles. It was predicted during the war that the survivors of lung-irritant gases would get consumption, while those burned by mustard gas would develop cancer. This has not happened, but it is the sort of rumor that easily starts. For, after all, our greatest weapon in chemical warfare is not gas, but education, and education of all classes. By education, I mean a process which puts people in general in touch with the thought of the abler minds of their own and past times, whether in literature or art, in science, mathematics, or music. An educated man knows enough science to distinguish a gas from smoke, or a Grendel Matthews from a Marconi, even if he is not well versed in the kinetic theory of gases or the laws of radiation through the ether. Educated men are quite rare. It will be worthwhile giving some examples of how our uneducated politicians and soldiers failed to adjust themselves to the scientific thought of their contemporaries. He found a rather curious state of affairs. In April 1915, a relatively educated member of the government got hold of a physiologist, whose name I suppress as he is a modest man. On the Emden, a German cruiser captured in the Indian Ocean, a German sailor had been found with a pad of lint and tapes to tie over his mouth. It did not even cover his nose, and, though it might or might not have been useful against smoke, it was of no use at all against gas. However, a very prevalent belief at that time, and perhaps still, as far as I know, was that German scientists were vastly superior to British ones. It is true that there are more of them, but I believe that their average achievements over the last 40 years have been, if anything, slightly below those of our own. So hypnotized, however, were some of the authorities in this country by this theory that it was being proposed to issue these articles to our troops. He identified the gas used by the Germans as chlorine. After pointing out their uselessness, the physiologist in question was rushed over to France in a destroyer, along with a chemist. On his return, he obtained a cylinder of that gas, released some into an airtight chamber, and devised a rudimentary respirator that would keep most of it out, testing various methods on himself. Emden. Upon returning to the War Office, rather short of breath from the chlorine he had inhaled, he discovered to his horror that an appeal for home-made respirators had been issued to women across England. Their design was apparently based on the captured German one, which had very probably been made en fee. As they were quite useless, he secured a promise that they would not be sent out to France. Things were not made easier by the opinion held in high military quarters that, offence being more important than defence, the great thing was to reply to the Germans by gassing them. As, however, this could not be done in less than 5 months, while respirators could easily be made in a week, it led to a delay at a somewhat vital moment. Finally, every important decision taken in England had to pass through the hands of Lord Kitchener, who naturally had not time to weigh the arguments at all fully. It is not my intention to attack Lord Kitchener. The fact that the war could continue at all under such a system proves that he was a great man. But if he had managed to delegate some of his powers, he would have proven himself greater. Due to all this delay, many of the initial respirators had to be made in France. Convalescent soldiers and nuns in a convent on the Mont des Cats were drafted to make respirators, which, though unattractive, were quite efficient. Unfortunately, shipments of Women of England and other homemade respirators kept arriving in France, and occasionally caused a battalion or so to be eliminated. I arrived at St. Omer from my comfortable trench as being a person accustomed to poisonous gases in civil life. I am able to give these details because at this time I, who before and after was an honest infantry bomb officer, made my brief incursion into chemical warfare. In a large school, converted into a hospital, there was a small glass-fronted room, like a miniature greenhouse, into which known volumes of chlorine were liberated. We had to compare the effects on ourselves of various quantities with and without respirators. It stung the eyes and produced a tendency to gasp and cough when breathed. For this reason, trained physiologists had to be employed. An experienced physiologist has more self-control. An ordinary soldier would probably restrain his tendency to gasp, cough, and throw himself about if he were working a machine gun in a battle, but could not do so in a laboratory experiment with nothing to take his mind off his own feelings. As each of us got sufficiently affected by gas to render his lungs unduly irritable, another would take his place. It was also necessary to see if one could run or work hard in the respirators, so we had a wheel of some kind to turn by hand in the gas chamber, not to mention doing 50-yard sprints in respirators outside. None of us was much worse for the gas, or in any real danger, as we knew where to stop, but some had to go to bed for a few days, and I was very short of breath and incapable of running for a month or so. This work, which was mainly carried out by civilians, was recognized with the award of the Military Cross to the brilliant young officer who frequently opened the door of the medical general's motor car during his visits to the experiments. The soldiers involved could be identified for a time by the distinctive green color of their brass buttons due to exposure to the gas. Even when arrangements had been made for the manufacture of respirators in England, the supply suddenly dried up. It was found that the girls who made them were working as best they could with raw and bleeding fingers, and London was being scoured for rubber gloves. His name, needless to say, does not appear in the official history. Someone had altered the formula of the mixture in which the respirators were dipped by substituting for carbonate of soda, caustic soda, which has the property of dissolving the human skin. Such were some of the difficulties which we incurred in our anti-gas work through the ignorance of highly placed persons. As, however, our defensive, though not our offensive measures, were ultimately better than those of any other nation, things must have been still worse elsewhere. The success of our respirators was largely due to one man, Harrison, whose name is insufficiently known to his countrymen. He was an analytical chemist, and author of that admirable and too little read work, Secret Remedies, published by the British Medical Association. Naturally, the ignorance of our private soldiers was of an even more abysmal character. He enlisted as a private, but was a lieutenant colonel when he died of influenza and overwork in 1918. Again, in 1917, 80 of mustard gas cases vomited, while this symptom was rare in 1918. In the early days, they often removed the respirators from their faces and tied them around their chests, as it was there that they felt the effects of the gas, the working of their own bodies. Apparently it took 5 months for the British Army to realize that gas poisoning did not necessarily mean poisoning through the stomach. If we persist in believing that we can be saved by patriotism or social reforms, or through military preparation of the sort that would have sufficed in past struggles, we shall be overcome by a nation with more realistic perspectives. If, then, in future wars we are to avoid gross mismanagement in high places, and panic and stupidity among the masses, it is essential that everyone should learn a little elementary science, that politicians and soldiers should not be proud of their rank. Ignorance of it, that ordinary men and women should not be ashamed or afraid of knowing something of. We do not know what kind of scientific knowledge will be required. We can be certain that some kind will be. The British are a weary people. They prefer rest in breathless quiet after all their troubles, and place their trust in the promises of leaders whose gaze is fixed on history. It has all occurred before. I cannot lift from my eyelids the weariness of quite forgotten peoples, nor hold away from my terrified soul the dumb downfall of far stars. The Roman and Spanish empires appear to have perished largely from intellectual torpor. Are we to follow the same path? We must overcome our aversion to scientific thought and scientific method. And yet these soldiers would have had no hesitation in shelling the horses of hostile gun teams, and the vast majority of them were in the habit of shooting animals for sport. To take an example from the war, the physiologists at the experimental ground at Porton in Hampshire had considerable difficulty working with many soldiers due to their strong objections to animal experimentation and open contempt for those conducting such tests. I have never known a physiologist who went in for shooting animals. Physiologists know too much of the processes which occur in a wounded beast or bird that creeps away to die. And, though I have seen a good many scientific experiments on animals, I have never seen one which, so far as concerns the pain given, I should object to having performed on myself. They both entered a chamber containing 1 part in 2,000 of the gas. In order, he writes, that the experiment might be as fair as possible, and that my respiration should be relatively as active as that of the dog, I remained standing, and took a few steps from time to time while I was in the chamber. That this attitude is not unusual would appear from the following experiment described by the director of the Porton experimental ground, in which he wished to compare the effects of hydrocyannic or prussic acid gas on himself and a dog. In about 30 seconds the dog began to get unsteady, and in 55 seconds it dropped on the floor and commenced a characteristic distressing respiration, which heralds death from cyanide poisoning. 1 minute 35 seconds after the commencement, the animal's body was carried out, respiration having ceased, and the dog being apparently dead. I then left the chamber. As regards the result upon myself, the only real effect was a momentary giddiness when I turned my head quickly. This lasted about a year, and then vanished. For some time it was difficult to concentrate on anything for any length of time. It is hard to say to what extent this was due to the experiment. One of the arguments against science is that it is responsible for such horrors as those witnessed during the recent war. As a result of this work, hydrocyannic acid was discontinued in field use, as phosgene is effective at 50 times this dilution, and mustard gas at 1,000 times. You do not mind whether they are used to kill or to cure. You scientific men, we are told, never consider the potential applications of your discoveries, and so you devise the means of universal destruction, and sell them into the hands of unrighteous and bloody-minded men. Your method of thinking, doubtless satisfactory when dealing with molecules and atoms, renders you insensible to the difference between right and wrong, nor do they install a well in their back gardens to enjoy drinking the richer water of a pre-scientific age, with its interesting and variegated fauna. I note that the people who make these remarks do not refuse to travel by railway or motor car, to use electric light, or to read mechanically printed newspapers. Let us imagine the great war fought with all our means of transport and preventive medicine, but no weapons more complicated than swords, spears, and possibly a few bows. But it is quite easy to show that the destructive and horrible nature of modern warfare is due, not to the weapons used, but largely to the other applications of science which constitute the material basis of our civilization. With fewer munitions, the armies could have been mobilized even more rapidly, and more men deployed in the fighting line. The Germans would probably have attempted, as they did in 1914, to initiate a Schlacht ohne Morgen, a battle of reversed fronts modelled on Cannae. No doubt it would have been over sooner, but the losses would probably have been just as great. The fighting would probably have been about as severe as at Cannae, and men would have been fighting in close order, 10 or 20 deep, along a 100-mile front. The chief difference might have been that the Russians would have been victorious by mere weight of numbers, and the French defeated. The French and Germans would doubtless both have continued fighting until at least half their armies had become casualties, and with 4 years' fighting compressed into as many weeks, it would have been impossible to tend more than a fraction of right. The wounded. They also moved very slowly. In former wars, slaughter was limited by the fact that large armies could not be fed, and developed epidemic diseases. So it took 23 years from 1792 to 1815 to wear down the resistance of the French nation. Furthermore, the Great War was the first since the Second Punic War of the 3rd century B.C. between two great civilized nations, each fighting with all its might. This fact accounts for its ferocity. Modern transport and hygiene made its scale possible. The weapons used merely served to prolong it. The objection to scientific weapons, such as the gases of the late war, and such new devices as may be employed in the next, is essentially an objection to the unknown. But with gas, or rays, or microbes, one has an altogether different state of affairs. Fighting with lances or guns, one can calculate, or thinks one can calculate, one's chances. Poisonous gas had a great moral effect, just because it was new and incomprehensible. As long as we permit ourselves to be afraid of the novel and unknown, there will be a very great temptation to use novel and unknown weapons against us. Now, terror of the unknown is thoroughly right and rational, so long as we believe that the prince of this world is a malignant being. But it is not justifiable if we believe that the world is the expression of a power friendly to our aspirations, or if we are atheists and hold that it is neutral and indifferent to human ideals. It will by now have become clear to you that I am writing somewhat parabolically. What I have said about mustard gas might be applied, mutatis mutandis, to most other applications of science to human life. If it is right for me to fight my enemy with a sword, it is right for me to fight him with mustard gas. If the one is wrong, so is the other. They can all, I think, be abused, but none perhaps is always evil, and many, like mustard gas, when we have got over our first not very rational objection to them, turn out to be, on the whole, good. But I have no sympathy whatever for Mr. Facing both ways when he says that, though he is prepared on occasion to fight, he will not use these nasty, new-fangled weapons. Of course, I am not suggesting that we should violate, or prepare to violate the Washington Agreement on this subject. Such are the facts about chemical warfare. I do, however, believe that we ought to denounce it at the earliest possible opportunity. They will not be believed because a belief in them would do violence to the sentiments of most people. They will not be promoted, as there is no money to be made from them. Chemical manufacturers make both high explosive and mustard gas, and the former more easily. The views which I have expressed do not coexist in the mind of any party leader or newspaper proprietor, and must therefore be those of a crank. But until a stronger argument can be presented against them than that they are unusual and unpleasant, there remains the possibility that they are true. No. Transcriber's notes. Text in italics is enclosed by underscores italics. Punctuation and spelling inaccuracies were silently corrected. Archaic and variable spelling has been preserved. Variations in hyphenation and compound words have been preserved.